Hey, so we are finally together in a room after a long, long time. Right, so I just thought I will discuss how the last 3.5 years have gone for Rainmatter, and you know what 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 we're looking forward to in the next 3 years as we do this. So when we started in 2020 November, I think, um, I was pretty much doing this alone, but trying to figure out what climate change means in the context of India. We were getting sucked into a lot of different conversations, in rooms with think tanks, policymakers, other funders. And it was all around the energy framing. It was all around the framing on the mobility transition, the the renewables energy transition, and so on and so forth. But I think we've come a long way since then. We managed to ask questions that led to a better understanding for ourselves, but I think also for the sector. So I think there is a wider understanding of what climate means in terms of the lived realities of people, in terms of adaptation and mitigation, but not necessarily in separate silos. We still have, of course, a long way to go before we figure out how this is operationalized, how this becomes a reality in government structures, in organizations' own structures, in philanthropy and in CSR. But I think it's useful to look back on what we have achieved, um, what we have understood out of this, and more importantly, what are the opportunities through which we can really move this ahead in the next, let's say, 3 years. So, of course, I was doing all of this alone in the first few days, and slowly various people have joined the team. Because you've joined us for rural, and more recently, said Mandeep, and now Sathya handling urban, restoration, energy. They're looking at specific areas like construction, ecosystem incubation. What does all of this add up to? I'm just trying to understand that, um, because I've lived the journey on a daily basis, but at various points of time, you guys have come in, and you've first seen it as an outsider, but now you have an inside view on it. So I'm just curious to hear from your view and from where you stand, what this looks like. So because you're looking at the rural strategy now, you're also interested in a whole bunch of other things, including how the ecosystem works, livelihoods work, and so on and so forth. So what did this mean to you when you stepped in? What does it started to mean to you now?
Right. So actually, when we came in, it started off as a food systems transformation, right? And having been following natural farming for many years now, following farmers who are doing it. So it started off as a food systems transformation, but having gone through several discussions with the communities, with the people, what we realized is, natural farming or specific individual things which we may do may not help in fighting the climate change holistically. So that's where I think there was a bit of a change in terms of how we started looking at it from the rural side. So food systems, then slowly we got in livelihoods into it. Then we got in some of the other aspects of beyond food and fodder. So from that lens, from starting from a food systems, it went into slightly a bigger basket of what people need over there and how they can do it themselves, right? So that was on one side, and the other side was, if people don't take ownership of the place, right? What are we trying to do here? We're trying to fight climate change, and place is a very important aspect of it, right? Ultimately, whatever we are doing is having an impact on the place.
Yeah, the whole planet is a place, and
Right.
every place we inhabit actually adds up to becoming the planet. So yeah.
So now trying to help people take ownership of the place and then decide what they want to do, and then provide them with an options of uh, or a sustainable path towards that change, right? Be it livelihoods, be it food systems, be it any aspect of their life, wherever they want to start with, we're trying to provide them with an option with which they can choose from. Right. So that will involve a whole lot of things, starting from collectivization, starting conservation of the forest, restoration of the forest, and that's where I think Sid comes in, and it's a big help to have those people work with the communities to, one, improve the forest, improve the soil, improve the water, along with a host of things like health of the people, health of the animals, birds, and everything over there.
Yeah, I think that's interesting you said that, because I think initially the focus was, even for us, may have been a bit more siloed and looking at different verticals, but now I think it's coming together a little more, where maybe we're looking the conservation focus, we're looking as with conservation and with the rural thesis or with the urban thesis or the energy. So tying it all in, I think, and that's what we're looking at doing now. And one of the biggest gaps that we see in the conservation space, or we've noticed over the few years, is also how do we mainstream conservation, right? And that forms part of what we look at as the thesis. And I think going forward, that's what we'd really like to look at, is mainstreaming conservation, so it becomes part of everybody's day to day, not just conservation biologists or wildlife biologists having to deal with it, and the people at the forefront of it are people you're working with in the rural space. And similarly with Sathya, for example, we're looking at how do you talk about conservation in an urban context. I mean, these are things we're yet to explore or trying to figure out how to work on. Satya's recently looking at that.
We've had this trouble trying to. So a place is obviously, everything. It's livelihoods, it's your incomes, it's your commons, it's the soil there, it's the water there, the air there, it's the energy systems there. It's everything. As an owner of the place, you don't have the luxury of focusing on one dimension of it or the other, right? And we've in the rural context, like Vikas was saying, we're trying to see how what ownership looks like and how people understand ownership better. But honestly, Satya, we've struggled to understand this in the urban context, because people move to the city for jobs and livelihoods and these very individual personal benefits, right? It's an agglomeration, it's an economic engine. It's usually governed much more centrally and harder than villages. A village is still a community. A city rarely looks like a community. So what does ownership mean in that context? Who governs the city? What is the idea of the commons in the city? Functional ecosystems in the city. What role does the city play? Because the city has a huge responsibility, especially in the climate problem.
True. So that's where we set the framework of what the city means to all of us, right? It's basically a net demand aggregator, if you look at it. We don't grow food in the city, we don't mine minerals in the city. But you need to be able to make things, you need to be able to value add to things. That happens in the city. Right? You take the food, you package it, you value add, you take minerals, you make some widgets out of it, and you consume them. And then you let out a lot of waste as well. Right? You don't know where it goes, how far your stuff is coming from, you don't know all of those things. But how did the city come to be? Because let's say we are situated now at a point in time where there is also going to be this enormous growth. There are these national security issues, and then there's this growth thing that we are chasing for a better per capita income. In all of these pressures, we are going to have to look at the cities as engines of growth, or that's what it is being looked at. And also the cause of a lot of these problems that we create, whose footprint travels far and wide, right? So the balance that needs to be achieved in urban is, along with trying to identify a sense of the place for people, we should start intervening in the transactions of people. Try to understand what are the transactions happening in a city, because it's largely a consumption-led story. And that's where I think at Rainmatter we are trying to evolve a strategy which takes into account the fact that the problems need to be solved. We need to reduce all of the problems that we are creating and take into account all of these things, right? Whether it is energy or biodiversity or the rural livelihoods that are actually trying to create some things for us as well. How do you bring all this together? And how do you account for climate friendly growth that we need to have? Because those are also a part of our strategic national interest, because you need to get, we have very low tax to GDP ratios. We're going to have to bring more people in, so you generate more income. All of those pressures are there. And while we achieve that, can we achieve that differently? And that's something that we have to evolve along with the people who are working on the ground. So one of the biggest things is there are so many of us, including myself for the past decade that we've been working. I've seen a lot of people working in different cities, trying to make them. 50% of our population lives in cities, and by some account it's extrapolated to mean 70% will be. Do they need to be? We should question that. Can it be different? We can envision that. We can probably work together with rural and envision a different distribution. And we can look at a lot of the tier 2 and 3 cities which want to emulate these economic successes, making similar mistakes. Right? How do you change that trajectory and help inform those people, or help them in a different way of growth that can still achieve your targets but differently? I think that's the kind of way we have to imagine it. And it's not about our imagination across this table, it's about the people on the ground who are working on a lot of these things have to come back together, sit with us and say, we'd like to imagine that differently. And we'll figure out where that goes. But if we don't make an attempt, and we don't attempt to change the lock-ins, the path-dependent lock-ins that we have, it is built on how we know how to grow.
This Satya cuts across all the theses, right? This whole idea of, not of getting people who worked in the space, or all the different actors, as it were, out there, to actually come together and talk about what these issues might look like and how we want to solve them. And I think that's something that has been encouraged from the get-go, but it's also something that I think coming around in terms of how we're building out coalitions and collaboratives and things like that. I think it's something that we're really focusing on across the thesis areas.
Right. So, like, very interestingly, I was just remembering that the first time I met Siddharth, we were talking about that I have some experience in renewable energy development, and that's been my career for the last 10 years. And the first thing Siddharth says that, okay, so you are the guys who are causing me so much grief, right? So that was the first instance where we sort of, the line between a project thinking and an ecosystem thinking got delineated, which was very clearly established that a lot of funders or CSRs do this sort of approach of approaching a project specific thinking, that a certain project is funded which has only a limited outcome. But they are all part of a larger ecosystem. So that is the ecosystem thinking that we are again referring to. So that was the initial context setting itself, and that just changed your thought process of how we should think about it more holistically. And now coming specifically to energy, then when you start thinking about energy as a overall system, it's quite a critical component from a climate perspective, because 70% of our GHG emissions are caused by energy, and we import 40% of our energy. So from an economic perspective, as well as social, a national security perspective, as well as for our obligations towards climate, we need to transition away from these emissions, right? And then, but the way we transition it is also very important, because in the past we have made similar goals of becoming a more urbanized, a better country, but we have not really thought of all perspectives in a systemic lens perspective, and then we have ended up making bad trade-offs. So our thinking again around that got developed too, that what are the areas that could still be a blind spots when we go through this transition. Some of the areas we identified was clearly, one of which was biodiversity, that when we do this transition, when we acquire so many land parcels, when we import so many minerals, are we thinking about the biodiversity impact of it all? Are we thinking about the mining impact of it all? Are we involving the communities properly to do this decisions? So that has been a learning curve, and that has been sort of a strategy towards energy going forward.
So you touched upon the idea of not doing projects, and that's something we realized early on, that you can't change climate in pockets. You can't do a little project here and a little POC there and say in these 2 villages this problem is solved, and make any meaningful dent in a problem as large as climate or biodiversity. So obviously when we think of climate, we think of it much more than in the sense of carbon and emissions, right? So as we started to say not projects, the question was then what, right? We started with institutional support, but then we soon realized that what really creates change is ecosystems, right? An ecosystem of actors, of roles being played, and so on and so forth. So it was not enough to just support individual institutions and assume that they would actually start to solve a problem meaningfully. How they interact with other institutions is an ecosystem emerging, and so on and so forth. That became important. So I have a different question to ask on this, honestly. I mean, because when we speak to people outside sometimes, we get a not a pushback because we are on the side of funding, so sometimes the pushback doesn't come very explicitly. Sometimes it comes politely. Uh, but we have heard that it's a little utopian to it's a little ambitious if you're generous about it, or a little stupid if you're not, to think that you can change entire sectors, entire networks, or influence their way of thinking through certain questions, certain infrastructure, bringing coalitions together, and so on and so forth. So tell me very, very honestly, from your individual perspectives. I know Vikas and I have been on a WhatsApp group dreaming of all this for the last, I think, 8+ years in a different context. But as you stepped into this and you realized this almost, the Vishwarupam of problems, this behemoth where everything connects to everything and we got to solve everything, and without that it's not worth it. Um, what was your first reaction? Was it like, I know you use the word mad very often, right? But what did it sound like to you? And from there, where have you arrived at today?
Right. So I think clearly I think I also had the same feeling that we are being too ambitious or utopian, right? Is the way. Then you step back into previous ways of thinking about stuff, and then I say, okay, let me start to think about like how I have been doing other stuff earlier in my life, right? And let me try to carve out a way, and then you still go back to the same drawing board. Look at the where do you start, right? And where do you start in a meaningful way? You can always do again coming back to, you can always do a project, you can always fund a solar light or a rooftop solar at a particular village or etc. But what will that do, right? And then you go back to the same thing, that these solutions already exist. There is already money available. There is no technical issue, there is no financial issue, but overall this is not working out. So it's probably a ecosystem problem. There is something is not gelling among the players which are participating. So that got me like thinking more around the same lines. And then I like slowly started thinking not in a that the utopian is a good way to understand where the ideal state should be, what the gaps are, and our role will be to nudge towards those gaps. I don't see we solving all the gaps. We are going to make trying to do some delta movement towards that.
And it takes a village. It takes all the other actors and their pushes and their nudges, and we are just one player. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, it's in a way, it's not something new that we've thought of as come to us, as it were. It's so many people have, built coalitions, have worked together, have done it. For many reasons, it hasn't necessarily come together. People haven't been able to pull it off, or some people have. I think we're just reigniting that and enabling people to. So it's not like we have that utopian madness. I think a lot of people who actually have worked in these spaces and want to do that work are equally that, but maybe because of the way funding has been before, for multiple reasons, it's forced people into this project mode where you're literally going after very fixed numerical targets. And as we free that space up, or we talk to people about it, I think people are excited as well. So it's not, I think it's just being in the right place at the right time for that and enabling that to happen, which is really exciting. And I think it might take a little while for everyone to kind of agree that it might make sense, and maybe it totally doesn't. We might be totally wrong on it. But
someone once commented that it's almost like people on the problem-solving side have switched over to the funding side at Rainmatter. So that maybe that explains some of it.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
So the way I look at it in the urban space is, it's like a game of chess. shouldn't be making moves if you don't know what it's going to lead to. But when the opponent makes a move, you need to know how to change back your pivots and then move it forward. It's not like you have the whole solution crafted out, but you have an idea where you want to go. And that is very clearly defined, and we have institutionalized it, saying we have to go against net zero, we have to solve for biodiversity loss, we have a lot of issues in our cities where climate change is causing us daily harm, right? The government is today spending a lot of time and effort fixing the problems we have created for ourselves instead of productively taking us forward. So it's actually bringing them back. So we know that problem exists and we need to figure out how to solve it. So one of the approaches is to see if all of us can move towards trying to fix this problem in steps, but by reimagining it differently and not you doing it the way you already knew how to solve it. Of course, everybody who's solving has an idea of how they need to do it and how they think they need to do it, but there's a wide variety of people who solve it in different ways. And if we enable all of those to happen, or many of those to happen, the predominant ones, and if the big guns who are firing on all cylinders trying to fix a problem also start working in an imagination, in a concerted imagination that we need to fix the climate problem and yet be able to still offer growth. That reconciliation, if it happens, we will be able to chart a way forward. And it's not to solve the problem in its entirety today, but to imagine a pathway and keep nudging our goals towards a path which might lead there and making certain adjustments along the way.
So is it fair to say that we are almost like interlocutors between different worlds, different worldviews, between the market and the social and the research, and trying to help bridge these gaps, bring people together, trying to, to use a much abused word, create synergy between them?
That's exactly what our RMF 2.0 strategy is, if you look at, right, is to come and figure out how do we bring all these heads together and start piecing this in our minds and bringing all the collaborators and partners we have also piece it together with us. And if it doesn't work out, we learn. And we bring all of the three pillars of democracy, the state, market, and society, to play in this in a way that we start aligning tweak certain levers here and there to see can we move towards this goal a little faster and keep aligning and keep looking at how do we solve this climate problem along with satisfying our goals that we have set for ourselves. And we are not saying at any time that the priorities now aren't there. There are certain priorities, but it is not mandatorily or necessarily including the climate, which is currently looked at as an add-on. So how do you not do that? How do you internalize this? And many players are doing that. How do we accelerate that? And how do we get the entire development sector, civil society, the markets, the consultants, and everybody else together in a way that we can push forward? And if we can help in any way, we'd like to be of help and see if that can happen. But it is necessary that we need to think that way. Otherwise, we just can go business as usual, and that's not going to fetch us anything. If we are not helping think something differently, then why are we there?
Yeah.
Also, I mean, we're sitting on a ton of privilege, right? Like, because we don't have to run a project, we don't have to do a lot of things. I mean, in so many ways. So it is a nice space to be able to enable that for other people, not just for us to think differently or have that opportunity, but even just for people who are doing that, whether in the urban, rural, conservation, energy space, which to take you away from that whole project mode, to actually be able to just innovate and think freely about how you can do that. And we're happy to support that kind of stuff, I think.
Yeah. And very interesting.
But talking of privilege, we're also just a bunch of 5 dudes sitting here chatting away.
Yeah.
Sure,
Our team
sure.
actually does have other people,
Represent
but
the team.
but yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So again, like as you're talking about like thinking differently, like the whole narrative around energy has largely been to fix the supply side. That if we somehow transition away from coal and oil, and then if renewables come in, that would be the magic pill. But is it really? There's also a demand side, right? The supply side also, does it factor all the other constraints that come with it? Can we really manufacture that many minerals? Do we have that much land parcel? Aren't there any trade-offs that we need to do this transition? And then you go, so then again, if you then think about the whole system, there's also a demand side. Aren't there any demand side fixes? Aren't we really misusing a lot of energy. Like again, so that demand side also gets distributed between urban and rural. On the urban side, there is so much excess of energy, and excess not in terms of that we don't have any blackouts, but we are easily wasting energy, and we don't think twice about it. If you keep running your air conditioning on 22, when you can leave it at 26 and still be okay. We don't think about it. We don't make those decisions. And on a larger scale, at the industry level also, these are never really a trade-off. Energy is probably at the last metric for them to base their decisions on. So, and then similarly, the other component of demand side is your rural side, where there's an access issue. You don't have enough, right? And because you don't have enough, you're not creating those microeconomies in those places. People are coming into the urban side. Everybody just wants to get in the urban cities, and that's it. That's the only imagination. But if you have enough energy access there, you will have micro industries. Those micro industries will be there. Education will be there. Healthcare will be there, and people would like to build up those micro economies around those places. So that's also a very interesting overplay, that this demand side also needs to be looked into. Yeah,
Right.
quite closely.
I think he got a very interesting fact over there, right? The microeconomies. Now, on the rural side, that's one of the things we're trying to chase is the decentralized production systems, which can create those microeconomies. Now, and that's where your earlier question of, was there any pushback on when we try to change the direction? I think creating this, so there is a lot of effort which has gone in the last 20, 30 years, and numerous experiments which has happened all over the country towards this microeconomies, right? And right now, I think the time has come for all these efforts to come together and make a huge impact on the ground. So the idea now is to create a 1 + 1 = 11 rather than a 2.
Yeah. So in this sense, I mean, there are a bunch of roles we are playing beyond just being a funder, obviously, right? We are trying to bring people together. We are trying to make sure collaboration becomes smooth, networks are formed, ecosystems are formed. People understand their roles. Every actor is not trying to do everything by themselves, but sees themselves as, just like we do, as part of an ecosystem. What is it, especially given the funder role, that we should not do? Because this also, as we almost have a take and a meta level program, if you will. It's not a very hard defined project, and we obviously are not prescriptive. But as we start to roll out a certain view that's forming with other partners, as we start to take it out to other philanthropies, larger sectors, start a dialogue with the government, right? What are the boundaries? What are the lines we should not cross?
There's a lot, no? There's a lot of lines. I mean, that's why it's like privilege is also power, and it's also a lot of things. So I think A is to not think that we actually know it all or even know anything. And I think people who work in the space have a really good view of things. And so how do you actually enable that as opposed to telling people what to do? I think that's a big challenge generally when you have access to be able to do something. So that's something we shouldn't do. At the same time, not be totally just enamored by somebody speaking really well about, I have this figured out, because nobody really does, and if they did, then it would have been fixed, right? So how do you really partner with people and not just say that either people know what they're doing, we should leave them alone, or really enforce what we do? I think that balance of actually trying to build partnerships as opposed to have a funder and a grantee. And how do you really build it into a partnership where there is sharing and learning across? So we shouldn't do the funder grantee is what I'm saying. Like we say, we don't do projects per se. It's not like you don't do projects, but that shouldn't be the focus. Yeah, maybe here and there you will have projects that need to be done to fit the work that needs to go along, but we really shouldn't do these very hard lines of these power dynamics have to be kind of eased out. It's a tough one because there is an existing structure like that, but that's one. I mean, you guys have any?
So one of the things is just the same thing that you said, right? One is we are not having all the answers on the table, but we learn from each other and see how the answers evolve as we go along. And yeah, we don't just try not to answer all the questions right up front, but be cognizant of the fact that there is a need for a momentum, and while we push for that, we stay back and learn from what's happening on the ground. And I think that's the biggest thing, that if we need to learn, so we stop to learn first before we try to push for anything. I think that's
Similar to like what we talk about in the conservation thesis, of nature led, where you don't necessarily have to intervene everywhere. Is how do you actually observe and step back? And nature does its thing. So you don't always have to have interventions. And a lot of the times interventions can lead to a lot of other stuff. So that's something I think we not shouldn't do, but should keep in mind maybe.
Probably not get into micromanagement.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, what I was saying was that I think we don't do it, but that's the larger system. There's a general category of CSRs where there's a CSR and a grantee sort of relationship, right? And the term which is used quite often is they are the beneficiaries, which is quite a look down sort of a condescending sort of a comment, that they are not the beneficiaries. We are the beneficiaries. If some problems are going to get fixed, the climate is going to get fixed, the planet will be better. We are the beneficiaries. We are not doing a favor to anybody by giving them a grant. But that's the terminology that comes into mind. So rightly the point on looking at it thing as a partnership, and understanding your role also, and let them also play their role also. So not to take away their role in the whole scheme of things.
Yeah, another thing I've learned over the last year and a half, we are consumed by a certain set of problems, right? Whether it's the urgency of the climate problem, or how badly biodiversity is being attacked everywhere, and so on and so forth. But I've had to step back from my need and my urges to communicate something, to try and meet people where they are.
But have you, Samir? You've been all over social media, man. I don't know if that's so true.
No, but you try.
Imagine
right?
if you
Like,
actually followed those urges. Imagine how much we'd have of that.
if people have a need to fund innovation in a certain way,
Yeah.
that has a role to play in this as well. How do we map it out that they can continue to fund innovation, or do research, or deal with communities in a certain way,
Right.
etc., but thread it together?
Right.
How do you make use of it in the climate context?
Yeah.
How do you bring the climate lens to it,
Yeah.
rather than change their thinking and change their lens? Because you typically start with your view on it.
Right. And try and, yeah, so this thing
Yeah.
of don't go and try and change.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
But
mean,
leverage
it's a
people's-
nudge. It's not like you will change nothing, but
Yeah.
don't try
But
to
why
make
even-
wholesale changes.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And also try, like, I think, leverage what exists, or the skill sets. I mean, that might be what we're trying to do, right?
Yeah, there are many building blocks out there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Use the ones that work.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's actually very interesting that we understand very well the lines that we should not be crossing, right? And I'm also starting to see that even inside the team, we talk about intersectionality and that climate affects everything. We are starting to see how our thesis melds with other theses in the organization itself, and we're starting to collaborate across these silos and boundaries. And hopefully we'll start to see a lot of this across the network, across governments, across funding, and that's how the climate problem will really get solved, when we start to account for the trade-offs across these silos and boundaries. So, I mean, we have to start living it first, and it's good to see that we're getting there. If you were to quickly just imagine, if it all works, if there's a magic wand and 3-5 years, this whatever you're dreaming of, or whatever we are collectively dreaming of through each of us, starts to work, what does it look like? Because
I would say rural places are more aspirational, and these become more ecologically, economically, and socially sustainable. So, yeah.
so
Just
Kumarappa's and Gandhi's vision coming true.
We are thinking more logically than ideologically, right? So let's look at it logically. Whatever is possible within the rural domain, it's possible.
No, so I tried to not imagine the ideal scenario, but given you had the magic wand and you said you gave it to me, so let's try and see if we can wave it around and fix all the problems. So the net consumption comes down. We have a different economy, which is a completely green economy, right? And we are able to use that and show the world how we can craft an alternate way of living in cities, consuming less, reduce the footprint, be aware of our own consumption and wastes and how we are able to live, and the quality of life goes up, right? Right now we are all chasing something called a standard of living. So we have to start measuring quality of living, which is not just the hard infrastructure, but how we live, what we consume, and things like that. So if we make, of course, we don't have a metric for quality of life, and we are trying to define that along with all of our partners and say, how do we start measuring this new thing, which includes a climate lens in how we look at quality of life. And if we can get there, we would have a wonderful quality of life, and that's what I think we will get towards. And we have to make it happen faster. And in this, all of the state, market, and society are playing their roles in the best way possible with minimalist footprint, but still creating widgets and services for us to go forward.
Yeah. And all of this as the stronger, urban places have robust, functional ecosystems.
Magic wand. If I had magic wand then, and this really all worked, then the skies would darken every evening with birds in the thousands and millions where you wouldn't be able to see for 15 minutes. Your shipping lanes would be hitting whales and, getting stopped because of those many whales in the ocean. So that's the magic wand, or there wouldn't be these kind of ships. I mean, I think magic wand is really that. Is really having wilderness and wild spaces everywhere, and the interconnectedness between that. And the communities who actually know how to use that, how to live with that, live closer in that sense to nature. That's the magic wand wish. Realize we're getting our ass kicked nicely, but that would be my magic wand.
Right. So again, then that would come back to the ideal state in a way. So ideal state would be that our production and consumption of energy is a lot more sustainable, and there is energy is also accessible to everybody and is also affordable for everybody, and this is also sustainable financially. That the burden is not levied on the state. The whole system is self-sustainable for the long run. So that would be the sort of ideal state. In a medium-term scenario, as you said, the 5-year scenario, it would be that as we go through this energy transition, we at least understand all the factors, all the externalities of this transition among all the players, and that awareness should be among all the players, not just in one silo or with one at one place.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, if you're able to stitch this imagination up for the whole country and the whole planet, I mean, we one is, the meteor that's coming our way, that's already starting to hit really, in some sense. We have to navigate around it. We have to shock absorb the impacts of it. And I think all of these solutions, being more resilient economically, locally, it being linked to our biodiversity, having stronger natural ecosystems, having cities which have a smaller demand footprint, more NMT and cleaner commons, better, more distributed access to energy, it being financially viable because we are managing it in ways that are not always an ask from the state. I think these help us not only shock absorb better, adapt better to the changing thing, but also offer a different pathway and a different imagination of development. We are very stuck in ways of the last entire century, where we've continuously been making bad trade-offs and accruing debt in something else, somewhere else in the future. And I think if we start to learn how to re-engineer our systems, re-engineer our imagination, even our measures, right, to actually stop accruing this debt and start working with natural ecosystems rather than against them. I think all of us coming together would have achieved something. Yeah.
No. What was the issue? Long, right?
Hey, that was not allowed.
Give back the one.
Okay, up to you. Yeah. That this discussion has been too civil for anybody's taste.
That's right. Okay, cut. Go for it. Go for it. He's not there.
You're a podcaster, man.
So I like these kind of chairs that may enable us to be nice to each other. But just like Vikas has taken off, I think we should all just take off. So
I don't think it is the chair.
I'm done.
I don't think it is the chair. Looks like I'll be the only one left here to wrap it up.
This is getting weird and weird. You don't know, we are actors only.
We are all running off into our own worlds and talking to a lot of people, trying to solve the problem. One's gone for a call, the other one left. So we have our work, but we still are able to sit together and get this done. Let's do this again.
Awesome.
Great.